There are towns in the Canadian West where a woman becomes the quiet center of everything without ever trying to be, not because she performs it, not because she seeks it, but because something in the way she moves through a room, some combination of steadiness and warmth, and the particular honesty of a person who has never learned to be otherwise, makes people feel, without quite knowing why, that they are standing a little straighter. In Harlow Creek, Alberta, in the autumn of 1887, that woman was Fern Colby. She was 27 years old, the schoolteacher at the single-room schoolhouse on the edge of town, the daughter of a retired surveyor who had come west 20 years ago and never found a reason to leave. She had brown hair she kept pinned back during school hours and loose on Sundays, and eyes that were a particular shade of amber that made people feel when she looked at them directly that they had been genuinely seen. She was patient without being passive. She was kind without being soft. She had the particular quality of a person who has decided, somewhere along the way, that the world deserves her full attention and who gives it freely without keeping score. Every suitable man in the Harlow Creek district had noticed Fern Colby. Several of them had done considerably more than notice. There had been invitations to Sunday suppers, flowers left on the schoolhouse steps, a rancher from the next valley who had reportedly written the letters so earnest it made her father set down his pipe and stare at the ceiling for a full minute before saying anything. A merchant from Calgary had come through one autumn and spent 4 days finding reasons to stop by the school. A widow with 3 children and the largest grain operation north of the river had asked quietly, through an intermediary, whether she might be open to a conversation. Fern had declined all of them, warmly, with the kind of genuine regret that made the rejection worse because there was nothing cold in it to be angry about. People had theories, the way people in small towns always do. She was too particular. She was waiting for someone from back east. She had decided to give her life to teaching and had made a kind of private vow about it. The school board chairman's wife was convinced she had a broken heart in her past that explained everything. None of them were right. The answer was considerably simpler and considerably more inconvenient. It had a name. The name was Hugh Callender, and he was, with almost impressive consistency, the only man in Harlow Creek who had never once thought to try. What no one knew, not the school board chairman's wife, not Fern's father, not even Hugh himself, was that time was quietly beginning to run out. Hugh Callender was 32 years old and ran the sawmill on the eastern edge of town. He was not the most prosperous man in Harlow Creek, not the most polished. He was tall, with the kind of hands that belong to a man who has been working with wood since he was 12 years old, capable and unhurried and slightly rough at the knuckles, and a way of listening that made people feel they had his complete attention, which they did, because Hugh Callender did not know how to give anything by halves. Other men described him as reliable, which is either a compliment or a way of saying unremarkable, depending on who's doing the describing. What Hugh was, without any performance about it, was good. He fixed things, not just the obvious things. Fences, equipment, the widow Hartfield's leaking roof, but the less visible ones. He remembered what people told him. He showed up when it was inconvenient. When the Métis family, who had settled 2 miles out of town, came in one winter with nowhere to store their grain, Hugh opened the mill's back storage without being asked and never mentioned it afterward. He was the kind of man who does the right thing quietly and then is genuinely puzzled when anyone notices. He and Fern had known each other for 4 years. She had arrived in Harlow Creek in the autumn of 1883. The new teacher, 23 years old, and carrying a trunk full of books that Hugh had helped carry from the wagon to the schoolhouse because he'd been walking past and it seemed obvious. They had built the easy, unexamined friendship of 2 people who simply fit into each other's company, who could share a silence without filling it, who laughed at the same things, who had the dry, quiet humor of people who observe the world carefully and find it consistently surprising. He looked at Fern the way you look at the northern lights, aware, every time, that he was seeing something extraordinary, grateful that it existed, and somehow never quite registering that he was allowed to have feelings about it. On a September morning that particular autumn, Fern was at the general store sorting through a delivery of chalk and copybooks when Hugh came in for a bag of nails and some lamp oil. The store was warm and smelled of pine resin and dried herbs. "Morning, Fern," he said, the way he always said it. "Morning, Hugh," she said, the way she always answered. He paid for his nails and oil. He left. She watched the door for a moment after it closed, then went back to her chalk. Outside, Arthur Vane, a rancher who had asked Fern to the harvest dance 3 years running and accepted each refusal with increasingly philosophical good humor, fell into step beside Hugh on the boardwalk. "You know," Arthur said in the mild tone of a man who has been sitting on a thought for some time, "for someone who works with precision instruments all day, you have a remarkable inability to measure what's directly in front of you." Hugh looked at him with genuine puzzlement. "What are you talking about?" Arthur looked at the sky. "Nothing," he said. "Absolutely nothing." But he was thinking about something that Hugh didn't know yet, that a man named Clifford Dunmore had been in town for 2 weeks, staying at the Harlow Creek Hotel, asking quiet questions about the local school, the teaching staff, the general character of the community. Clifford Dunmore, who was 44 years old, who had made a considerable fortune in dry goods distribution in Regina, who had moved to the Alberta district the previous spring after his wife passed, and who had the quiet, deliberate manner of a man who, once he decided something, did not easily undecide it. He had come to the schoolhouse twice that week with what he described as questions about the district's educational needs. He had stayed both times considerably longer than questions required. The Harlow Creek Harvest Social was held at the community hall on the last Friday of September, which in Alberta meant the smell of wood smoke and the particular golden quality of light that comes when the aspens have turned and the sky is that impossible shade of blue that only exists for about 2 weeks every year before the cold arrives for good. Fern went because she had helped organize it, and because not going would have been unkind to the 12 children who had spent a week making decorations. She wore the green dress her mother had sent from Ontario, and she arrived with the calm, warm attention she gave everything, accepting dances, making conversation, being genuinely present in a way that some people found exhausting to watch because it made them aware of how rarely they did the same. Clifford Dunmore arrived an hour in. He was well-dressed in the unhurried way of a man who has never had to think hard about money. He asked Fern to dance with the confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. She accepted because refusing would have caused the specific kind of scene that a schoolteacher in a small community cannot afford. He was a good dancer. He was also watching her, she noticed, with the careful attention of a man conducting a private evaluation. Not unpleasant. Simply deliberate. The kind of man who collects information and then acts on it, systematically. Across the hall, Hugh arrived late, sawdust still on his jacket from an afternoon job, accepted a cup of cider from the refreshment table, and stood against the wall in the comfortable way of a man who was genuinely happy to watch the world go by. He saw Fern dancing with Dunmore, thought, vaguely, that she looked like she was being politely patient. She caught his eye across the room and smiled. Not the public smile she'd been wearing all evening, but the other one. The quick, private one that had always been just for him, gone before anyone could remark on it. He smiled back. Then someone asked him about a milling quote, and he turned his attention elsewhere with the easy obliviousness of a man who has no idea what he has just failed to understand. Across the room, Fern watched him turn away. Then she looked back at Clifford Dunmore, who was watching her with that same careful, deliberate attention. And she felt, for the first time, the cold edge of something she had not let herself feel before. The possibility that waiting had a limit, that patience, however genuine, was not the same thing as a plan. 3 days after the social, Fern's father, Thomas Colby, who had the unhurried, direct manner of a man who had spent 20 years reading landscapes and calling them accurately, sat on the porch steps while Fern hung laundry in the side yard and said, without particular preamble, "That Dunmore fellow came into the hardware store yesterday. Fern kept hanging laundry. He seems to come into most places. He asked after you." Thomas paused. "Not generally, specifically. Whether you had any particular attachments." whether you were content to stay in Harlow Creek long term. Another pause. The kind of questions a man asks before he makes a more formal approach. Fern's hand slowed on the sheet she was pinning. "He's a serious man," Thomas said carefully. "Steady, the kind of settled that comes from having built something once and knowing how it's done." He looked at his daughter. "I told him you made your own decisions, which is true. I just thought you should know the landscape." Fern finished pinning the sheet. She picked up the next one. "Papa," she said, "do you know why I've said no to every man who's asked? I have a theory. It involves Hugh Callender." "It does." She was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't see it. I've waited. I've been patient for 3 years, waiting for him to see what's been right in front of him, and he looks at me the way he looks at the northern lights. Like something he's glad exists and never thinks about reaching for." Thomas was quiet. "Dunmore is a good man," Fern said. "And if Hugh doesn't—" She stopped. Started again. "A woman can only hold something quietly for so long before it starts to cost her." "How long are you willing to wait?" Thomas asked, gently but directly. She looked at the mountains to the west, the ones you could see on clear days above the tree line, already showing their first snow. "Not much longer," she said quietly. And she meant it. Arthur Vane found Hugh at the sawmill on a Tuesday morning and told him plainly the way people tell things to men who need plainness. Clifford Dunmore was going to make a formal approach to Fern Colby before the month was out. Hugh was running a measurement along a beam. He didn't look up immediately. "Where did you hear that?" "From Dunmore's man at the hotel, who mentioned it to the hardware clerk, who has no reason to invent things." Arthur leaned against the doorframe. "I'm telling you because you're my friend, and because you are, I say this with a genuine affection, occasionally the least self-aware man in a 50-mile radius." Hughes set down the measuring line. He straightened. "What does that have to do with me?" Arthur looked at him with the specific patience of a man who has been waiting a long time to have a particular conversation. "Hugh," he said, "Fern Colby has turned down every man who's asked her since she arrived in Harlow Creek. Every single one, and there is a reason for that. And the reason is currently standing in a sawmill pretending he doesn't understand what I'm saying." The mill was quiet. A beam shifted faintly in the wind outside. Hugh looked at Arthur for a long moment. "She'd never," he started. "She has been," Arthur said, simply, "for years, and Dunmore doesn't know that. And if you wait much longer, she's going to have to make a different kind of decision. A reasonable one. Because she's a reasonable woman who has been patient past what most people would manage." He pushed off from the doorframe. "I've said what I came to say." He left. Hugh stood in the mill for a long time after, with the particular stillness of a man whose understanding of something has just rearranged itself entirely, the way a landscape looks completely different the moment you realize what you're actually seeing. Fern, who had been Fern, always just Fern, his friend. He stopped. He went through the past 3 years with a kind of careful, deliberate attention he realized, with some discomfort, he should have applied considerably sooner. The private smile across the room, the way she always had time for a conversation with him, specifically, the look on her face the morning at the general store when he picked up his nails and left without what exactly? Without seeing what he was walking away from. Clifford Dunmore. A month. The measuring line was still in his hand. He set it down carefully, like a man who has suddenly understood that some things, if you wait long enough, do not wait back. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in October when the aspens had gone fully gold and the air had the particular cold clarity that comes just before the first hard frost. Fern was walking back from the schoolhouse, taking the longer route past the mill because she always did. Because any amount of time near Hugh was better than none, even when it looked like nothing. Even when it was just a conversation about the weather or the price of lumber or whether the Henderson boy was improving in his arithmetic. Hugh was outside splitting kindling. He heard her on the path, looked up, and set down the axe with the unhurried deliberateness of a man making a decision. "Fern," he said, "do you have a minute?" "I have a few," she said. Because she always did, for him. They talked, first about the usual things. The cold coming in faster than expected, the Milburn family whose eldest had just started school, the roof on the community hall that everyone agreed needed attention. And then Hugh stopped talking about those things and looked at her. Really looked, in the way he occasionally did when he forgot to be casual about it. And something moved across his face that she hadn't seen before. Not quite recognition. Something more urgent than recognition. Something that looked like a man finally understanding the cost of his own inattention. He took a breath. "I heard about Dunmore," he said, that he's been asking about you." Fern went very still. "I have no right to say anything about what you decide," Hugh said. "I know that. I haven't earned the right because I've been standing next to something and failing to see it, which is its own kind of failing, and I know that." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "But I need to say something before you make any decisions. I should have said it a long time ago." The mill creek moved quietly behind them. The aspens let go of a few leaves. "I love you," he said. "I think I've loved you since that first autumn when you had a trunk full of books and you told me the titles of every single one while we carried it. And I thought, there is a person I want to know for the rest of my life. And then I spent 3 years deciding that was impossible, which was. I think that was the least accurate assessment I've ever made." He paused. "I couldn't let Dunmore. I couldn't let you think no one saw you. Because I see you, Fern. I have always seen you. I was just too slow to understand what seeing you meant." Fern looked at him for a long moment. The gold light moved through the aspens. Then she took one step closer and said, quietly enough that it was only ever going to be his, "Hugh, I have been waiting for you to say something like that for 3 years. I had almost given up." A pause. Almost. She held his gaze long enough for the words to settle. "Don't make me wait anymore," she said. And Hugh Callender, who had spent 3 years looking at the northern lights and never thinking he was allowed to reach, took a step forward. "Before we go on, I want to know something. Where are you listening from today? Drop your city or province in the comments. It means more than you know to understand where these stories land. Now, let's go back, because Hugh Callender still has something important to do. He went to see Thomas Colby the following morning. Good shirt, combed hair, the expression of a man who has made up his mind and is done deliberating with himself. Thomas was on the porch with his coffee. He looked at Hugh, the shirt, the expression, the particular way Hugh was carrying himself, like a man who has recently remembered what he actually values, and said nothing. He simply waited. "Sir," Hugh said, "I'd like to come calling on Fern properly, starting today, if she's agreeable, and I'd like your blessing to do it." Thomas looked at him for a moment. "Hugh," he said, "you have been coming to this house for 4 years and eating my wife's cooking and making my daughter laugh. You are approximately 3 years late. But yes," he looked back at his coffee, "you have my blessing." Fern came to the door a few minutes later, having heard Hugh's voice from inside. She stopped in the doorway, and the look she gave him was direct and clear and without any of the careful patience she had been carrying. Just, "You're here then? I'd like to come calling on you properly," Hugh said. "I know I should have said all of this considerably sooner. I'm aware of that." "You should have," she agreed, but she was almost smiling. "I'd like to make up for lost time," he said, "if you're willing." She stepped off the porch. "You'd better start then." What followed was the most discussed courtship in Harlow Creek's recent history, which is saying something in a town where the social calendar is limited and people pay attention. He brought her wildflowers the next day, not purchased, just noticed on the path between the mill and the school and picked, because they were there and she would like them. She put them in a jar on her desk, which caused considerable comment among the older children and diplomatic silence among the younger ones. He came to Sunday dinner at the Colby house. Thomas was warm. Fern's mother, who had taken the train out from Ontario for a visit and arrived, as if by design, at this precise moment, spent the first 10 minutes observing Hugh with the focused attention of a woman who has had opinions about the situation for some time, and then spent the rest of dinner being very pleasant, which told Fern everything she needed to know. On an afternoon in November, they walked out to the ridge above the creek, where the valley opened up and you could see the river and the aspens in the mountains beyond, and sat in the cold, clean air and talked about real things. "Why me?" Hugh asked, with the genuine puzzlement of a man who is still slightly staggered by his own luck. There were better options, more practical ones. "You never performed anything," Fern said. "Every man who came along was presenting something: his land, his income, his standing, his prospects. You just showed up the same way every time. The same person." She looked at the valley. When you spend years watching people show you their best face, a person who shows you their actual face becomes the thing you can't stop thinking about. Hugh was quiet for a moment. "Dunmore is a good man," he said. "He is. You could have. Hugh." She turned to look at him directly. "I waited for you. Not because I had no other choice, because I knew what I wanted and I was willing to be patient about it." A pause. "Don't make me explain that more than once." He looked at her, this woman who had carried something quietly for 3 years and offered it to him without conditions, on a dusty October afternoon outside a sawmill, and felt the particular, complete gratitude of a man who understands exactly what almost didn't happen. The valley was gold below them. The mountains were doing what they always do. He proposed on a December evening outside the schoolhouse after the children's Christmas recital, in the cold, clear dark, with his grandmother's ring in his coat pocket, a simple band he had cleaned carefully and carried for 2 weeks, waiting for a moment that felt honest. "Fern," he said, "I need to say something directly because I have been unclear for long enough and you deserve better than unclear." She looked at him. The cold air had put color in her face. She was waiting with the particular patience of a woman who has been patient before and knows how, but is also, quietly, done with waiting. "I love you," he said. "I think I've loved you since you told me the titles of every book in that trunk. I know I was slow to understand that, and I am aware that is not a recommendation for me. But I understand it now, completely. And I would like very much for you to be my wife." He paused. "If you're willing to take on a man who needed 3 years and a competing suitor to work out what was standing right in front of him." Fern was quiet for a moment. "Hugh Callender," she said, "that is the least elegant proposal I have ever heard." "I know. It was probably about half as poetic as the occasion called for. At least half." The cold wind moved down the street. Somewhere inside the hall, one of the younger children had started playing the same carol for the 3rd time. "Yes," she said. Simply, after 3 years of patience, the word that had always been waiting. He put the ring on her finger in the cold December dark, and she looked at it the way you look at something you recognize. Not new, just finally, completely yours. They were married in February, just before the worst of the prairie winter broke. The community hall was full. Half of Harlow Creek had, with some justification, the feeling of people who have been watching a long game finally reach its conclusion. Arthur Vane, in the 2nd row, was observed to be considerably more moved than a man of his stated philosophical disposition about such matters had any reason to be. Fern wore her mother's dress, taken in at the waist. She walked toward Hugh with the unhurried certainty of a woman arriving somewhere she has always been headed. Hugh stood at the front of the hall and watched her come, and felt, with sudden, complete clarity, how close he had come to missing this. How a man could stand next to something that mattered for 3 years and fail, out of some combination of habit and assumption and the particular blindness of people who take for granted the things they most love, to see it. How Clifford Dunmore had come within a month of making an offer. how another week of his own inattention might have sent everything in a different direction entirely. He was not going to waste another day of it. They said their vows simply and meant all of them. The years that followed were good ones. The sawmill grew steadily under the combination of Hugh's skill and Fern's eye for accounts. She discovered in the first month that he had been undercharging for half his work, corrected it with the brisk efficiency of someone who taught arithmetic to children and had no patience for unnecessary imprecision. And Hugh did not argue, because he had learned quickly that on matters of numbers and common sense, Fern was simply right. Their daughter arrived in the second year. They named her Ruth, for Hugh's grandmother, a girl with her father's patient, deliberate way of approaching the world and her mother's complete inability to leave a problem unexamined. Their son came in the fourth year. They named him James, quick and laughing and with a dry sideways humor that had always been Fern's, which made the house considerably louder and considerably more alive. On an evening in their seventh year, Fern was at the kitchen table marking copybooks, a habit she had kept even after she left the schoolroom to raise children, because the district was always short of teachers and she marked papers in the evenings as a way of helping without making a performance of it. When Hugh came in from the mill, still smelling of pine and cold air, and stopped in the doorway for a moment, just looking at her, she noticed without looking up. She always knew when he was in a room. "You're staring," she said. "I know. You used to not stare." "I used to not know what I was looking at," he said. "I've corrected that." She looked up then and smiled. The real one, the one that had always been his, even before he knew enough to recognize it. He crossed the kitchen and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back into him, and they stayed like that for a moment, while Ruth and James argued about something with the passionate conviction of children who have inherited stubbornness from both sides. Hugh pressed his lips to the top of her head. "I see you," he said quietly. She didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. She had always known. She'd just been waiting for him to say it. Years later, when Ruth was old enough to ask, she asked her mother how she had known. They were in the kitchen, Fern teaching Ruth the bannock recipe that had become something of a household institution. And the question arrived sideways in the middle of something else entirely, the way the important questions usually do. "How did you know Pa was the one before he knew?" Fern was quiet a moment, working the dough. "He never performed anything," she said finally. "Every man who came along was showing me something. Your father just showed up the same every time." She paused, and he was worth being patient for. Ruth considered this. "But you almost didn't wait. Because of the man from Regina." Fern looked at her daughter Hugh's eyes and her face, that same careful, direct gaze. "Yes," she said, honestly. "Almost." She handed Ruth the wooden spoon. "That's the part I want you to remember. Not the happy ending. The almost." She looked at her. "Know what you want. Don't perform for anyone. And if the person you're waiting for is slow, give them time, but not unlimited time." A pause. "At some point, you say the true thing. You give them the chance to show up." "What if they don't?" Fern was quiet for a moment. "Then you know," she said. "And you move forward, and you build something good anyway." She covered Ruth's hands with her own on the wooden spoon. "But in my experience, Ruth, when you say the true thing to the right person, they show up." She waited, Fern Colby did, but she did not wait passively. She taught school every day with her full attention. She showed up every morning as exactly herself, without shrinking, without performing, without making herself smaller or simpler to make someone else more comfortable. She was, every day, completely and specifically, Fern. And when the moment came, when she understood that patience without limits is not patience but resignation, she let Hugh see it, not dramatically, not as an ultimatum. She simply stopped hiding it entirely, and the October afternoon and Clifford Dunmore and Arthur Vane's plain speaking all arrived at once, and the thing that had been quiet for 3 years became suddenly, undeniably audible. That is not a small thing. Saying the true thing without knowing how it will land takes more nerve than most people give it credit for, and Hugh Hugh is not a man who failed some obvious test. He's something more familiar, a man who loved something so completely, so naturally that he had placed it outside the category of things he was allowed to want. He looked at Fern the way you look at the northern lights, and sometimes the thing that makes us finally move is not the arrival of love. We already had that. It is the understanding that love, like the northern lights, like anything worth stopping for, does not perform on schedule and does not wait indefinitely. They chose each other deliberately, at almost the last possible moment, but still in time. That is the part worth holding on to. Thank you for listening today. Wherever you are across this country, whatever province, whatever town, whatever kitchen or front porch you're hearing this from, I'm grateful you were here. Until next time.